Alright friends, welcome back to the channel. Today I have a video for you that I shot 3 years ago. It was a video that I intended to reboot this channel with, so I decided to make an edit out of this that was quite a bit smaller than what it was originally planned. I actually had done this over 6 to 7 episodes, and now I've kind of compiled all that into one shorter video that you're now watching. So what you're seeing me do right now is that I'm looking into the size of the shelter that I want to build. It's quite large. It was probably about 10 to 12 feet across. I wanted about 6 to 8 feet back. And and this has turned out to be quite a big project. As you know, 6 episodes of material with probably about 6 to 7 hours worth of footage. I spent a lot of time actually filming a lot of these scenes where I'm, cutting things up and moving logs around and doing little montages and stuff. And I enjoyed it very, very much, but it is kind of drawn out comparatively. And after I got the first logs, I decided I'd dig out these trees a little bit so that I could kind of brace the supports against the trees. And as you can see, I'm moving the logs into position to kind of get an idea on how high I need them to be. And then I'm going to cut them to the appropriate height, or at least the height that I think that I need it at. And then I basically made a ridgeline out of a log. Again, I didn't want to cut it until I knew exactly how far I wanted it across, because I wasn't sure how far out the sides I wanted to poke it out. So after I determined that, I cut it all off, and then it was basically a matter of trying to figure out, okay, is this going to be strong enough to hold the weight of what I'm going to move forward with? So now I have my basic beginning frame. Now I have to do my long supports for the back wall. Again, this is a big process where I have to kind of take my time, figure out what angles I want to work with, how much weight is going to be put on the structure itself. And then I wanted to basically mark off where I wanted to make my initial cuts. I went a little conservative to make sure that I didn't kind of overcut. And the reason behind that is that I could always trim it off if I found like I was getting too far along and made a mistake. So the first thing I needed to do is make some stakes, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a big log and I'm going to use that as a brace at the bottom of the structure in order to give it some weight, because these are kind of flimsy on their own. So as you can see, I'm pounding in this stake, and it's going quite well because it's pretty soft ground. But there is a lot of rocks in the area, so I had to kind of contend with that a little bit. As you can tell, it took a little bit of time to do that. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking my saw and basically measuring off the size of this log that I need. So I found the biggest one I could and then measured it off based off my measurements back at the campsite and gave her a little trim. Went pretty well. It's a pretty heavy log, but it was dead, so it wasn't as heavy as you would think it would be. And then I measured off my 2 support beams to just make sure I had the right length for the rest of the logs. And then I put a test log in the center just to make sure everything kind of looked okay and that the idea was going to work overall. The entire project took several days. I had to spend a lot of time collecting logs to get ready for the next stage of the build. This is a lot of stuff that I edited out over time because it's really, not really exciting stuff. So I wanted to keep this as simple as possible. So the next step was to start trimming some of these logs. Now I made a pretty big mistake when I was setting this up in the first round. A lot of these logs are quite small. However, they still are wide at one end and narrow at the other. So as I'm putting these logs in, they're essentially being flayed out in 2 different directions and then causing a kind of gap in the middle so that it wasn't like perfectly straight up and down, which is what I had in my mind. You can even see it in these shots where the width of the actual structure was probably not actually wide enough. It was probably coming in at an angle, which at the time, I can't remember, I might have actually thought that would be appropriate. But as you can see, there is a gap there. There's a gap between the last log and where I needed it to be. Then it was time to move on to the sidewall. As you can see, I had to cut each log to a specific length, otherwise it wouldn't really match things very well. So this is a little bit slow and tedious because the logs at this point were quite thin and small as I'd run out of all my large ones. But it was quite satisfying to put this together because of the angles that it was working on, so it looked really cool in my mind. Then I staked it in with another 2 poles, and then I used that ridge right there to support the logs because they weren't fastened to the main structure, and I was worried about wind and other things pushing it around and then, basically it collapsing on me without any warning. Then I had to finish up the other side, and again, this took a lot of time because I had to cut each piece to specifically meet a certain size. And in the end, it turned out really well. I liked the design, I liked the look, and it felt very solid and strong. So moving on to another day, it was time to start collecting the moss I needed to fill out the walls of the shelter. This was actually a really, really long process because, yes, there is a lot of moss around here, but it was in a patchy kind of way. So therefore, to get the high quality moss that I needed to fill in these gaps, I had to go all over the place. So I was basically dodging all these deadfall trees and twigs and branches and all these other things because I just basically wanted the pure moss that you see in these shots. So it took a lot of time to collect it. All I had was this garbage bag to bring it back with. So it was like several trips, probably like 30, I don't know, but it felt like a lot. So as you can see right now, I'm starting to throw up the moss, basically anywhere I feel like there's a hole. And then I packed it down as best I could. Then it was on to the branches. So the nice thing about this whole process is that a lot of the wood that I used and the materials came from the build itself. So a lot of these boughs that you're seeing in the shots is from the cut downs that I did earlier. Then it was just a matter of splaying all these boughs into the structure, basically trying to create a little bit of a water barrier between the outside and the moss, and then obviously the logs underneath. So this too was a long time in the making. I had to make several trips to go get all the boughs from all the logs that I cut. So this again was probably 30 or 40 trips to collect all these things. So now it's time to build my fire reflector because there is no shelter in the world that is worth its salt without a good fire reflector. So basically what I'm trying to do is trim some of the larger remaining logs into, say, 6-7 foot sections. Then I had to organize them so that they all laid flat on top of each other. So this is a very simple process to put things together. Once you get those stakes into the ground, then it's pretty easy to lay the logs down in place and kind of take your time to make sure everything's sitting nice and flat and flush. So now we're into the final stages of this build. I really wanted to make something a little unique, a little different than the standard shelter. That's why I chose the Adirondack shelter, because it has a kind of unique design that you don't see in a lot of lean-to shelters necessarily. However, mine's a little different because since I have that fire reflector, I'm going to use that to my advantage for building the Adirondack style. So the first thing I need to do is build some supports that would wedge into the fire reflector and then sit nicely on the ridge line. And then basically I tied this all off so that it wouldn't slip and slide around. Now that I had the canopy frame together, I had to cut sections of logs to fill this out. This again was a very slow process because I wanted to get a specific measurement so that they wedged in tightly against the back wall. Then it was just a matter of filling it in and making sure that it was as tight as possible so that I have less opportunity for rain to fall through on the shelter. And then we moved on to adding the moss again, just like we did for the side walls and the back wall. Again, it was really important to make sure that you had the moss cover the entire area because this will be a bit of a weak point when rain falls. So we want to make sure that it's properly covered. Then of course, the last step is to add the boughs. This ensures that the rain sheds properly and doesn't soak directly into the moss, and then you have a waterproof structure. Alright folks, thanks for watching, I really appreciate it. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to follow along for more content, and I'll see you on the next one.